My mother-in-law uninvited me from her Christmas gala because I was just a nurse. She looked me up and down in the freezing cold, told me my working-class background did not fit the aesthetic of her high society event, and handed me a $50 bill to call an Uber. I simply nodded and walked away into the snow. What she did not realize was that her perfect night was about to turn into a nightmare. Just a few hours later, the most powerful billionaire in Atlanta would collapse at her party, and the very nurse she banished would be the only person standing between him and death. Before I continue this story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit that like button and subscribe if you have ever had to stand up to people who underestimated your worth and treated you like you did not belong. My name is Maya. I am 29 years old and I work as a trauma ER nurse at Atlanta General Hospital. I have spent my entire life fighting for every single thing I have. I did not come from old money. I did not inherit a trust fund. I built my career on long hours, sore feet, and a relentless drive to save lives. But to my fiancé Julian and his mother Vivian, none of that mattered. To them, I was just a girl from the wrong side of the tracks who managed to catch the eye of a wealth management vice president. The night everything shattered was Christmas Eve. The temperature in Atlanta had plummeted to a bitter 2 degrees, a rare and biting cold that chilled you straight to the bone. I had just finished a grueling 12-hour shift and was preparing to cover another emergency shift later that night. Julian was attending his family's highly anticipated annual charity gala at the St. Regis Hotel. It was the social event of the season for Atlanta's Black elite. I had originally been invited, or so I thought, until Vivian conveniently forgot to add my name to the final seating chart, claiming a caterer error. Julian had told me not to take it personally, saying it was just a tedious networking event anyway. But when I got back to our shared apartment, I noticed something sitting on the kitchen counter that made my heart drop. Julian's heart medication. He had a minor but unpredictable cardiac condition, and his doctor was very strict about him taking his pills at exactly 8 o'clock every evening. In his rush to get dressed in his custom tuxedo, he had left the orange prescription bottle behind. Knowing how stressful these events were for him and how dangerous it could be to miss a dose, I did not hesitate. I grabbed the bottle, threw my heavy winter coat over my hospital scrubs, and drove straight to the St. Regis. The hotel looked like a palace illuminated against the dark winter sky. Luxury cars lined the valet entrance, and women in sparkling evening gowns stepped out, shivering elegantly as they hurried inside. I knew better than to walk through the front doors looking the way I did. My scrubs were wrinkled from a long trauma shift. My sneakers were stained, and my hair was pulled into a messy bun. I did not want to embarrass Julian, so I walked around the massive building to the service entrance near the catering bays. The wind howled through the alleyway, cutting through my thin coat, but I pulled out my phone and texted Julian that I was waiting out back with his medication. 10 minutes passed. My teeth began to chatter. I blew into my hands, trying to keep them warm. Finally, the heavy metal door swung open, but it was not Julian who stepped out into the freezing alley. It was Vivian. She looked breathtakingly regal in a floor-length emerald green gown, dripping in diamonds that caught the dim light of the alleyway security lamp. Her hair was styled perfectly, and her makeup was flawless. But the expression on her face was pure venom. She did not invite me inside to warm up. She stood in the doorway, letting the heat from the hotel spill out while keeping me firmly in the cold. "What on earth are you doing here, Maya?" she demanded, looking me up and down as if I were a stray dog that had wandered onto her pristine lawn. I held up the orange pill bottle, my hands shaking from the frigid air. Julian left his medication at the apartment. I know he needs to take it right now, so I rushed over after my shift to bring it to him. "Can you please give this to him?" "This too." Vivian snatched the bottle from my hand, but she did not step back inside. Instead, she crossed her arms and narrowed her eyes. Her gaze swept over my faded hospital scrubs and worn-out sneakers. The disgust radiating from her was palpable. "This outfit of yours," she sneered, shaking her head slowly. "Good Lord. I am so glad I managed to keep you off the guest list tonight. This is a high society donor gala, Maya. The Jack and Jill board is in there right now. The Divine Nine leadership is in there. People who actually matter. People with pedigree and legacy. I stood there too stunned by her blatant cruelty to form a response. The cold wind whipped around us, but her words burned like fire. I was used to her passive-aggressive comments about my background, but she had never been this openly vicious. You simply do not have the pedigree for our world, Vivian continued, her voice dripping with elitist arrogance. My son went to Morehouse. I went to Spelman. We come from generations of black excellence. You went to a public state college and you empty bedpans for a living. You do not fit the aesthetic tonight, and you never will. You are just a nurse. Just a nurse. The words echoed in the freezing alley. I thought of the patients I had held as they took their last breaths. I thought of the families I had comforted in their darkest hours. I thought of the blood, sweat, and tears I poured into my profession every single day. To Vivian, all of that meant nothing, because I did not belong to her exclusive social clubs or wear designer labels. Before I could defend myself, the metal door pushed open wider and Julian stepped out. He looked incredibly handsome in his tailored tuxedo, holding a crystal glass of champagne. For a split second, relief washed over me. My fiancé was here. He would put a stop to this. He would see me shivering in the cold, holding the medication I had driven across town to bring him, and he would stand up for me. Julian, I said, my voice trembling from the dropping temperature. I brought your pills. Your mother was just telling me. Julian did not look at me with gratitude or love. He looked at me with embarrassment. He quickly glanced back into the hotel hallway to make sure none of his wealthy friends were watching, then stepped out and pulled the door partially shut behind him. Maya, why are you making a scene out here? He asked, his tone laced with heavy irritation. I stared at him in disbelief. I am not making a scene, Julian. I brought you your medication because you forgot it. I came to the back door so I would not embarrass you. And your mother just told me I am just a nurse who does not fit her aesthetic. I waited for him to turn to Vivian. I waited for him to demand respect for the woman he had asked to marry him. Instead, Julian let out a long, dramatic sigh and ran a hand over his face. He looked at Vivian, then back at me, his eyes full of annoyance. Listen to yourself, Maya, Julian said, shaking his head. You are completely overreacting. My mother is just stressed about hosting this event. It is a very important night for our wealth management firm. Why do you always have to take everything so personally and make yourself the victim? The betrayal hit me harder than the freezing wind. He was gaslighting me. He was standing there in his expensive tuxedo watching me freeze in my work scrubs and telling me that I was the problem. He was siding with the woman who had just degraded my entire existence. She literally just insulted my education and my career. I said, my voice rising slightly despite my best efforts to stay calm. Julian held up a hand to silence me. Please stop yelling, Maya. You are going to make my colleagues hear you. Just go home. You are exhausted from your shift and you are not thinking clearly. Vivian smiled, a triumphant, razor-sharp smile. She opened her glittering clutch, pulled out a crisp $50 bill, and held it out to me as if she were tipping a valet driver. Take this and call an Uber. Vivian said smoothly. Go back to your little apartment and let the adults handle the real business tonight. I looked at the money fluttering in her manicured fingers. I looked at Julian, the man I had planned to spend the rest of my life with, who was now awkwardly taking a sip of his champagne and avoiding my gaze. He had his medication. He had his mother. He had his precious high society gala. He did not need me. I did not take the money. I did not scream or cry or throw a fit. I simply looked Julian dead in the eye and saw him for exactly what he was. A weak, spineless man hiding behind his mother's designer skirts. I understand, I said quietly. My voice was completely steady, stripped of all the warmth and love I had once carried for him. I understand perfectly. I turned around and walked away. I heard the heavy metal door click shut behind me, sealing them back inside their world of luxury and warmth. I walked through the dark, icy alley, my sneakers crunching against the fresh snow. Every step I took away from the St. Regis Hotel felt like a step toward a new reality. I was done making excuses for them. I was done trying to prove my worth to people who were committed to misunderstanding me. I got into my car and turned the heater on, full blast, gripping the steering wheel until my knuckles turned white. The clock on my dashboard read 10:15 p.m. I had 45 minutes before my next emergency room shift began. I took a deep breath, wiped a single tear that had escaped down my cheek, and put the car in drive. I was a trauma nurse. I had lives to save. What neither Julian nor Vivian knew as they returned to their champagne and their wealthy donors was that the universe has a very specific way of delivering karma. They thought they had discarded me for the night. They thought they had put the working-class nurse in her place. But the night was far from over. And soon, the very elite society they worshipped would come crashing through the doors of my emergency room, begging for the exact skills they had just mocked. I pulled away from the loading zone, but the holiday traffic had the surrounding streets completely gridlocked. Rather than burning gas in a standstill, I decided to take a shortcut through the narrow service alley connecting the luxury hotel to the main boulevard. The cold was still biting through my car heater, chilling me to the bone. As my headlights swept across the rough brick exterior of the building, the bright beams caught a figure slumped heavily against the wall. It was an older black man in a plain, slightly worn suit. He was clutching his chest tightly, his shoulders heaving with ragged, uneven breaths. In a neighborhood where luxury cars and expensive tailored coats were the absolute norm, he looked entirely out of place, almost invisible in the dark shadows. But my rigorous medical training did not care about aesthetics, wealth, or zip codes. I slammed my car into park, threw on my hazard lights, and grabbed the basic first aid kit I always kept in the passenger seat. The freezing wind whipped my hair across my face as I sprinted over to him. "Sir, I am a nurse," I said, clearly keeping my voice perfectly calm but highly authoritative. "I am going to help you right now. Can you hear me?" He nodded weakly, his eyes wide with the primal panic that always comes from severe air hunger. His skin was dangerously pale, looking ashen beneath his deep complexion, and his lips carried a faint, terrifying bluish tint. I pressed 2 fingers firmly against his carotid artery. His pulse was thready and racing, skipping beats in a dangerous, highly erratic rhythm. "Look right at me," I instructed, placing one hand flat on his chest and the other securely on his back. "You are hyperventilating, which is making the terrible strain on your heart much worse. I need you to match my breathing exactly. In through the nose, out through the mouth. Nice and slow." I exaggerated my own breathing, forcing him to lock eyes with me and mirror the steady rhythm. 1, 2, 3 inhale. 1, 2, 3 exhale. For 2 agonizing minutes, we stood together in the freezing alley. Gradually, the frantic heaving of his chest began to slow down. The natural color slowly returned to his face. I wrapped my heavy winter coat around his trembling shoulders completely, ignoring the bitter bite of the wind against my own thin scrub top. "Thank you," he rasped, his voice raspy and incredibly deep. He leaned back against the brick wall, wiping a sheen of cold sweat from his forehead. I truly thought I was done for a moment there. My vital medication is inside, but the massive crowd was just too much. I simply needed some fresh air. "You need a lot more than air," I told him firmly, checking his pulse one more time. It was stabilizing, but the underlying dangerous irregularity remained. "You are experiencing a significant cardiac event. I am calling an ambulance right now to take you directly to Atlanta General." "No ambulance," he said quickly, raising a hand to stop me. "I have a private driver waiting on the next street over. He can take me safely. I swear I will go straight to the hospital." I hesitated, but he was fully alert-oriented and his breathing had returned to normal. I could not legally force him into an ambulance against his will. I carefully helped him stand, keeping a firm, supportive grip on his arm to ensure he was perfectly steady on his feet. "You handled that situation with remarkable precision," he said, his sharp eyes assessing me in a way that felt entirely different from Vivian's cruel, judgmental glare. "What exactly do you do for a living?" The bitter, painful sting of my recent encounter with Julian and his toxic mother was still completely fresh. I looked down at my stained sneakers and my faded hospital scrubs. "I am just a nurse," I replied quietly. The words tasted like bitter ash in my mouth. The older man adjusted the collar of his worn suit. A faint, deeply knowing smile touched the corners of his mouth. "People never respect the oxygen in the room until they start choking, young lady," he said quietly. Never let anyone convince you that you are just anything. He handed me back my winter coat, thanked me sincerely once more, and walked steadily toward the main street. I watched closely until he turned the corner safely, then finally got back into my car. His profound words echoed loudly in my mind, pushing the lingering doubt completely out of my head. I put the car in gear and drove straight to Atlanta General Hospital to start my shift. The emergency room on Christmas Eve is always a completely different kind of terrifying war zone. The festive cheer of the holiday season stops entirely at the sliding glass doors of the trauma bay. Inside it is a chaotic, relentless symphony of cardiac monitors, alarming loudly heavy stretchers crashing against hallway walls, and the sharp, urgent commands of medical professionals fighting desperately against the clock. I swiped my security badge, grabbed a fresh cup of terrible break room coffee, and stepped directly into the absolute madness. There was absolutely no extra time to dwell on Julian. There was no time to think about the elite high society gala happening across town. The very moment my feet hit the cold linoleum floor, I was no longer the unwanted working-class girlfriend. I was Maya, the charge nurse of Trauma Bay 1, and I owned this entire floor. We got a massive 10-car pileup on Interstate 85. The senior attending physician, Dr. Evans, shouted loudly as I quickly tied my hair back and snapped on a fresh pair of blue latex gloves. EMS is bringing in 3 criticals right now. ETA is exactly 4 minutes. Maya, I need you on the lead trauma bed. Copy that, I replied instantly. I moved through the busy bay with practiced mechanical precision. I quickly primed the IV fluid lines, checked the defibrillator battery levels, and arranged the sterile intubation tray before the automatic doors even opened. In this specific room, social pedigree meant absolutely nothing. Your massive trust fund could not stop a hemorrhaging artery. Your exclusive country club membership could not restart a stopped heart. The only single thing that truly mattered here was clinical skill, blinding speed, and the rare ability to stay ice-cold under immense pressure. The paramedics burst aggressively through the double doors, pushing a bloody, battered stretcher. Male, 32 years old, unrestrained driver in a violent vehicle rollover. The lead medic rattled off rapidly. Heart rate is racing at 140. Blood pressure is tanking fast at 80/40. He is completely unresponsive. Move him over on 3. I ordered the trauma team firmly. 1, 2, 3. We smoothly shifted the broken patient onto the central trauma bed. Dr. Evans moved quickly to the head of the bed to secure the compromised airway, but the patient's jaw was clenched incredibly tight in a rigid trauma reflex. I cannot get the breathing tube in, Dr. Evans said anxiously, heavy sweat beading on his forehead. He is clamping down hard, pushing 20 milligrams of etomidate and 100 of succinylcholine. I called out clearly, instantly administering the powerful paralytic and sedative medications directly through the fresh IV line I had just established. I counted the long seconds in my head, watching the overhead monitor closely, as the patient's rigid muscles finally relaxed. "You are completely clear, doctor," I said. Dr. Evans slid the plastic breathing tube in perfectly. I secured it, tightly attached the ventilation bag, and started pumping life-saving oxygen into the man's damaged lungs. Meanwhile, my eyes darted rapidly to the portable ultrasound machine screen. Dark fluid was pooling heavily in the patient's abdomen. He was bleeding out internally. "We need to activate the massive transfusion protocol right now," I yelled urgently to the junior nurse standing frozen by the supply cart. "Call the main blood bank. Tell them I need 4 units of O-negative uncross-matched blood stat." For the next 4 exhausting hours, the busy trauma bay was a revolving door of broken bodies and desperate, heroic measures. I stabilized a terrified teenager with a shattered femur, brought a frail grandmother back from severe respiratory failure, and efficiently managed the endless flow of triage patients flooding the crowded waiting room. I barely had time to use the restroom, let alone check my cell phone. I was functioning on pure, unadulterated adrenaline, expertly navigating the chaotic, unpredictable dance of life and death. Around 2 in the morning, the initial rush finally broke. The harsh fluorescent lights buzzed overhead as I leaned against the nurse's station charting notes on a tablet. My feet ached, my back throbbed, and my scrubs were splattered with iodine and saline. But I felt entirely grounded. This was my true home. My exhaustion was playing tricks on my mind. I thought it was deep into the early morning hours, but a quick glance at the glowing red digital clock above the trauma bay doors corrected my sleep-deprived brain. It was exactly 11 p.m. The brief moment of quiet I had just enjoyed was nothing but the calm before a catastrophic storm. The heavy double doors of the emergency room did not just slide open. They burst apart with a violent crash that sent a shockwave through the entire department. Code blue. Code blue incoming. The frantic shout echoed from the lead paramedic, a burly man named Marcus, who I had worked with 100 times. He was sprinting down the pristine white hallway, his face flushed and dripping with sweat, straddling a moving stretcher while aggressively pumping the chest of an unconscious patient. A second paramedic was steering the gurney from the foot of the bed, struggling to navigate the sharp turns of the crowded ER while squeezing an ambu bag to force oxygen into the patient's lungs. "What do we have, Marcus?" I shouted instantly, dropping my charting tablet and sprinting toward Trauma Bay 1. My fatigue vanished, replaced by the sharp, familiar surge of pure adrenaline. "Older male, mid-60s?" Marcus yelled back, his breath ragged between chest compressions. "Massive cardiac arrest. Transported directly from a VIP event at the St. Regis." He collapsed right in the main ballroom. "We have got no pulse." He flatlined twice in the rig. I pushed 2 rounds of epinephrine and shocked him once at 200 joules, but we are still in ventricular fibrillation. We swung the stretcher violently into the trauma bay. The bright surgical lights snapped on, automatically illuminating the patient's face. I froze for a fraction of a second. It was the man from the alley, Mr. Sterling, the man who had been struggling to breathe against the freezing brick wall, the man who told me never to let anyone convince me I was just a nurse. His slightly worn suit had been ripped open by the paramedics to attach the defibrillator pads. His chest was bruised from the aggressive CPR. His face was entirely devoid of color, an ashen gray that signaled death was standing right in the room with us. "Get him on the monitor," I barked, snapping back into reality and shoving my personal recognition aside, switching out on compressions. 1, 2, 3. I jumped onto the step stool next to the bed, locked my elbows, and threw my entire body weight into Mr. Sterling's chest, taking over the CPR rhythm. The physical exertion was immense, but my focus was absolute. We needed to establish a viable airway and push more life-saving cardiac drugs immediately. But before I could shout my next order to the trauma team, an ear-piercing scream shattered the intense focus of the room. "Do not let her touch him. Get your filthy hands off of him right now." I did not even need to turn my head to recognize that shrill, entitled voice. It was Vivian. She came storming into the emergency room like a hurricane of emerald green silk and diamonds, completely ignoring the massive red signs restricting access to medical personnel only. She was not alone. Right on her heels was Julian, his custom tuxedo now slightly rumpled, his face pale and slick with panicked sweat. Following closely behind them were Julian's sister Chloe and his slick-talking brother Darren, both decked out in ridiculous high-society evening wear that looked completely absurd against the sterile, blood-stained backdrop of a Level 1 trauma center. "Security!" I yelled over my shoulder, maintaining my relentless CPR compressions. "Get these unauthorized people out of my trauma bay right now." "Do you know who we are?" Darren shouted, shoving a frantic triage nurse out of his way as he marched toward the glass doors of our room. He pointed an aggressive finger at the medical staff. "We are top-tier donors to this hospital network. You work for us. And that man on the table is our most important guest. You better treat him like royalty." Chloe was sobbing hysterically, clutching her designer ball gown and staggering around the hallway as if she were the one having a medical emergency. "He cannot die," she wailed, leaning heavily against Julian. "If he dies tonight, the entire fund collapses. We will lose the house, Julian. We will lose everything." Julian looked absolutely terrified, not for the man dying on the table, but for his own precarious financial future. He grabbed his mother's arm, trying to pull her back, but Vivian violently shook him off. She marched right up to the glass partition of Trauma Bay 1 and began pounding her diamond-ringed fists against the glass. "I demand to speak to the chief of cardiology immediately." Vivian shrieked, her voice echoing down the entire corridor and disturbing dozens of other sick patients. "I want the head of the department down here this very second. I absolutely refuse to let your regular incompetent staff handle this. Do you hear me? We need the best doctor in this city, not some glorified clinic workers." Dr. Evans, the attending physician who had just finished intubating our previous car crash victim, rushed into the bay. He looked completely bewildered by the sudden influx of screaming socialites in evening gowns. "Ma'am, you need to step back immediately," Dr. Evans ordered, firmly moving to block Vivian from entering the sterile field. "We are running a code blue. Your presence is endangering this patient's life." "Endangering his life!" Vivian scoffed loudly, her face twisting into an ugly mask of pure elitist rage. She pointed a sharp manicured fingernail directly at me. I was still standing on the stool, sweat dripping down my neck as I aggressively pumped Mr. Sterling's chest. "You are the ones endangering his life. You have a common, uneducated street nurse performing CPR on a billionaire. She is a nobody. I literally just fired her from my gala an hour ago because she lacks the basic pedigree to pour champagne, and now you are letting her practice medicine on the primary investor of our wealth management fund." Darren pushed his way forward, backing up his mother's toxic demands. He flashed a glossy black business card at Dr. Evans, as if it were some kind of diplomatic immunity badge. "Listen to me very closely," Dr. Darren sneered, his slick financial broker persona slipping to reveal raw, desperate panic. "That man on the stretcher is holding exactly $3 million of our family's capital in his charitable accounts. If his heart stops beating, our entire corporate structure goes into freefall by tomorrow morning. We will be bankrupt. So you better get that little scrub-wearing amateur off his chest and get a real doctor in here right now, or I will personally sue this hospital into the ground." I continued my compressions, ignoring the burning ache in my shoulders. 1, 2, 3, 4. My eyes stayed locked on the cardiac monitor. The jagged, chaotic lines of ventricular fibrillation danced across the screen. He was still dying. And these people, these horrible, greedy, superficial monsters, did not care about him as a human being. They only saw a walking bank account. They were watching a man fight for his last breath, and their only concern was how his death would impact their luxury lifestyle and their fraudulent financial portfolios. Julian Vivienne screamed, turning to her son, who was cowering near the nurse's station. "Do something. Throw your weight around. Tell them who your father was. Make them listen." Julian stepped forward hesitantly. He looked at me, his eyes wide and pleading, as if expecting me to suddenly submit to his mother's insane demands just because we used to share an apartment. "Maya." "Please," Julian begged, his voice cracking with pathetic weakness. "Just step away from the table. Let the real doctors handle this. You do not understand how much money is at stake here. Mr. Sterling is our golden goose. If you mess this up, you ruin my entire family." The sheer audacity of his request made my blood boil. He wanted me to let Mr. Sterling die to protect their wealth. "I need a pulse check," I shouted to Dr. Evans, completely ignoring Julian's pathetic whining. I stopped compressions for exactly 3 seconds. The monitor flatlined. A solid, terrifying, continuous beep filled the room. A systole. He had lost all electrical activity in his heart. "No pulse," Dr. Evans confirmed grimly. "Resume compressions. Charge the paddles to 300. Push another milligram of epi." "No, no, no!" Chloe shrieked from the hallway, dramatically dropping to her knees on the linoleum floor. "The accounts are going to freeze, Darren. The offshore accounts are going to freeze if he is declared dead." "Shut up, Chloe!" Darren snapped viciously, his sophisticated veneer completely shattered. "Keep pumping until the bank opens on Monday morning. Keep pumping until the bank opens on Monday morning." Darren's horrific words hung in the sterile air, a sickening testament to the absolute moral bankruptcy of Julian's family. But I had absolutely no time to process their unfathomable greed or the sheer depravity of their priorities. The harsh reality of the trauma bay demanded my complete and undivided focus. The continuous flat tone of the cardiac monitor pierced through the ambient chaos of the emergency room. Asystolo. A complete and total flatline. Suddenly, the overhead intercom blared to life with a blaring priority page. Dr. Evans stat to operating room 3. Massive internal hemorrhage. Dr. Evans stat to OR 3. The teenage car crash victim we had stabilized just minutes prior was crashing upstairs, and Dr. Evans was the only attending trauma surgeon available in the entire hospital tonight. Dr. Evans looked torn, his hands hovering over the sterile equipment cart, his eyes darting between the flat-lining billionaire on our table and the flashing red emergency light on the wall. He was effectively trapped. If he stayed here, the teenager upstairs would bleed to death on the operating table. If he left, Mr. Sterling was in the hands of the nursing staff and a terrified first-year resident. "Go!" I roared, locking my elbows and throwing my entire upper body weight into another cycle of deep bone-crushing chest compressions. "I have this code. Go save the kid." Dr. Evans bolted from the room without a second glance, leaving a wide-eyed, trembling first-year resident. Dr. Singh standing frozen near the head of the bed. Mr. Sterling's life was now entirely in my hands. The elite family clustered in the corner of the trauma bay, their screams escalating into a deafening, useless cacophony of panic. Chloe was hyperventilating into her designer clutch, while Darren paced frantically, pulling at his tuxedo bow tie and shouting empty legal threats at the ceiling. Julian stood plastered against the sliding glass door, completely paralyzed by fear, offering absolutely no help or comfort to anyone. "Charge the defibrillator to 200 joules, I barked to the junior nurse, sweat pouring down my forehead and stinging my eyes. "Charging," she replied, hitting the bright yellow button on the machine. But instead of the familiar high-pitched whine of the capacitors, loading a harsh grating error tone sounded. The screen flashed a bright red warning symbol. "It is giving a fault code," the junior nurse yelled, her voice pitching up with rising panic. "The internal battery is dead and the wall outlet cord is frayed. The defibrillator is malfunctioning. It will not hold a charge." "Swap the cables," I ordered, my voice cutting through the noise with absolute authority. "Do not panic. If the primary unit is dead, grab the backup unit from Bay 2 immediately. Go." She sprinted out of the room. I did not miss a single beat of my compressions. 1, 2, 3, 4. My shoulders burned with the intense buildup of lactic acid and my lower back screamed in protest, but I was completely in my element. This was my domain. The physical toll of performing continuous aggressive CPR is immense, but I pushed through the pain, driving my palms hard into the center of his chest to manually force blood through his failing heart and up into his brain. "Sing!" I shouted, snapping the frozen resident out of his terrified stupor. "Stop staring at the flat line and manage the airway. Bag him. 1 breath every 6 seconds. Do not hyperventilate him. Watch the end tidal CO2 on the capnography monitor. I need an intraosseous line established in his right tibia immediately. We cannot wait for peripheral IV access." Dr. Singh blinked hard, nodded rapidly, and finally sprang into action, grabbing the IO drill to establish a direct line into the bone marrow for rapid medication delivery. "Push 1 milligram of epinephrine," I commanded the medication nurse standing to my left. "Follow it with 300 milligrams of amiodarone. Flush the lines wide open. We need to jumpstart this heart right now." The atmosphere in the room was incredibly tense, a high-stakes pressure cooker where every single second stripped away another percentage of survival. The pungent smell of sterile iodine mixed with the metallic tang of blood, and the heavy, expensive perfume radiating from the screaming socialites in the corner. Their presence was a toxic, disruptive distraction. Vivienne could no longer contain her unhinged panic over her precious wealth management fund. Seeing the defibrillator fail and watching the attending physician run out of the room had completely shattered her carefully manicured composure. She breached the invisible sterile barrier of the trauma bay, her massive emerald green ball gown knocking over a tray of sterile surgical instruments. The metal tools clattered loudly onto the bloody linoleum floor. "What is happening?" Vivienne shrieked, her face twisted into an ugly mask of pure terror and elitist rage. Why did that doctor leave? Why is the machine broken? Do something, ma'am. You absolutely cannot be in this zone. The triage nurse pleaded, moving quickly to physically block Vivian from reaching the trauma bed. Vivian violently shoved the triage nurse aside with surprising force, her diamond necklaces clinking wildly. She lunged toward the head of the bed, her eyes wide and manic. She reached out and grabbed my forearm just as I was pushing down for another deep compression. Her sharp manicured fingernails and heavy diamond rings dug painfully through my thin scrub top and into my skin. "Get your filthy hands off of him!" Vivian screamed at the top of her lungs, spittle flying from her lips. "You are just a nurse. You do not know what you are doing. You are going to kill him and ruin my entire family. Get away from him right now." I forcefully ripped my arm out of her frantic grasp without breaking my CPR rhythm for even a fraction of a second. My eyes locked onto hers, and all the suppressed anger, grit, and working-class resilience I had built over my entire life flared in my gaze. I did not back down. I did not cower. I stared right through her superficial, wealthy facade and saw nothing but an empty, desperate woman. "Security!" I roared, my voice booming with such overwhelming authority that it startled even the medical staff. Two large, muscular hospital security guards, who had been trying to wrangle Darren in the hallway, instantly stepped through the sliding glass doors. They assessed the chaotic situation in a split second. "Get these people out of my trauma bay right this second," I commanded, pointing a blood-stained gloved finger directly at Vivian and then at Julian, who was still cowering near the sink. "I do not care who they are. I do not care how much money is in their bank accounts. I do not care what expensive designer clothes they wear. In here, I am the law. Get them out now." The security guards did not hesitate. The larger guard grabbed Vivian firmly by the arms of her expensive gown, completely ignoring her outraged shrieks about lawsuits and board members. The second guard grabbed Julian by the collar of his custom tuxedo, forcibly marching him backward into the hallway. "Take your hands off my mother," Julian stammered weakly, stumbling over his polished dress shoes as the guard shoved him out the door. "You cannot treat us like this." "I can and I will," I shouted back as the heavy glass doors finally slid shut, sealing the elite family outside in the hallway where they belonged. With the toxic distraction finally removed, the temperature in the room seemed to instantly drop, replaced by an intense, laser-focused clinical clarity. The junior nurse sprinted back into the room, hauling the heavy backup defibrillator. "Pads are on, backup unit is online and charging," she yelled, slapping the adhesive pads onto Mr. Sterling's bare, bruised chest. "Clear," I ordered, pulling my hands away from his sternum and taking a massive step back. "Everyone clear the bed." Dr. Singh dropped the ventilation bag and threw his hands in the air. The medication nurse stepped back. "Shock delivering now," the junior nurse announced. The heavy electrical current ripped through Mr. Sterling's body, causing his back to arch sharply off the trauma mattress before slamming back down against the sheets. I immediately jumped back onto the step stool and resumed my aggressive, flawless chest compressions. The adrenaline was pumping through my veins like liquid fire. I could feel the terrible crunch of his ribs beneath my palms, a gruesome but entirely necessary reality of effective CPR. "Push another milligram of epi," I barked, staring intently at the cardiac monitor. Come on, fight back. Do not let these people win." I pumped hard and fast, the rhythmic squeak of the bed frame serving as a metronome for survival. 10 seconds passed, then 20. The junior nurse hovered over the monitor, her eyes wide. "Hold compressions," I ordered, pausing mid-thrust and pressing my fingers firmly against the side of his neck. The entire trauma room held its collective breath. The chaotic, jagged lines of ventricular fibrillation on the digital screen suddenly vanished. For 2 agonizing seconds there was a flat line. Then a small, beautiful spike appeared on the green grid. Then another, and another. The spikes formed a steady, rhythmic mountain range across the screen. I pressed harder against his carotid artery. Beneath my fingertips I felt it. A pulse. It was faint and it was racing, but it was incredibly strong and undeniable. "We have a pulse," I announced loudly, letting out a massive breath I did not even realize I had been holding. "We have return of spontaneous circulation." Blood pressure is 85/55 and climbing. Heart rate is 92. Dr. Singh let out a loud, relieved cheer, slumping against the supply cart. The junior nurse quickly began hanging a bag of stabilizing amiodarone to keep the dangerous heart rhythms at bay. I grabbed my stethoscope and listened closely to his chest, confirming the steady mechanical beating of his heart. I had pulled him back from the absolute brink. "Start a central line," I instructed the team, my voice dropping back to a calm, measured, professional tone. "Let us get him prepped for immediate transport to the cardiac catheterization lab. He needs a stent, but he is stable for now. Excellent work, everyone." I stepped down from the stool, my entire body trembling with exhaustion and post-adrenaline shakes. I stripped off my bloody gloves and threw them into the biohazard bin, wiping the heavy sweat from my brow with the back of my forearm. Through the glass doors of the trauma bay, I could see Vivian, Julian, Chloe, and Darren pressing their faces against the glass, their eyes wide with disbelief. They had expected me to fail. They had expected the working-class girl to crumble under the immense pressure of their high society demands. Instead, they had just watched me orchestrate a medical miracle. They watched as the nurse they banished to the freezing alley completely dominated a room of highly trained professionals and single-handedly saved the billionaire golden goose they were perfectly willing to let die. I walked over to the glass door, looking directly through the transparent barrier at Julian. His custom tuxedo was ruined, his hair was a mess, and his face was a portrait of absolute humiliation and shock. I did not smile. I did not gloat. I simply gave him a look of profound, unwavering disgust, turned my back on his entire toxic family, and went back to charting my patient's vital signs. I had saved a life, and in the process, I had completely shattered their illusion of superiority. The morning sun breached the Atlanta skyline, casting long, harsh shadows across the hospital parking garage. My 12-hour shift was finally over, but my physical body felt like it had been run over by a massive freight train. Every single muscle ached with a deep, throbbing intensity. My scrubs still smelled faintly of iodine, sterile alcohol pads, and the sharp metallic tang of blood. I sat in my beat-up sedan for 10 full minutes, staring blankly at the cracked leather steering wheel, letting the profound silence wash over me. I had just pulled a billionaire back from the absolute edge of death while simultaneously navigating the most toxic family dynamic imaginable. But as I pulled into the driveway of the upscale Midtown apartment, Julian and I shared a heavy knot of pure dread formed deep in my stomach. The luxury sports car Julian leased was parked haphazardly in his designated spot. He was home. I unlocked the front door and stepped inside, dropping my heavy work bag onto the glass entryway console. I fully expected him to be asleep. It was 8 in the morning on Christmas Day. Instead, Julian was pacing the entire length of our spacious modern living room. He was still wearing the dark trousers and white dress shirt from his ruined tuxedo, though the silk bow tie was gone and the top buttons were completely undone. He looked disheveled, frantic, and absolutely furious. There was no warm greeting for his exhausted fiancé. There was no cup of hot coffee waiting for me on the counter. There was no inquiry about how I was holding up after performing brutal manual CPR for 10 straight minutes. The exact moment he heard the deadbolt click, he spun around and locked his dark eyes onto mine. His gaze was entirely devoid of affection. It was completely cold, calculating, and vicious. "Where exactly have you been?" he demanded, his voice echoing loudly off the vaulted ceilings. I blinked at him, my extreme physical exhaustion making my mind move a fraction of a second slower than usual. "I just finished my shift, Julian. I was saving lives. You know exactly where I have been all night." He let out a sharp, mocking laugh that sent a terrible chill down my spine. "Saving lives. Is that what you call it? Because from where I was standing, it looked a whole lot like you were throwing a pathetic, jealous temper tantrum in the middle of a major medical crisis." I froze completely in my tracks, kicking off my stained sneakers and stepping fully into the living room. "Excuse me, are you actually serious right now?" I restarted Mr. Sterling's heart. "Your mother was physically assaulting me while I was performing deep chest compressions." Julian closed the distance between us, jabbing a rigid finger aggressively in my direction. "Do not you dare put this on my mother, Maya. Do not you dare." I saw exactly what happened. You were embarrassed that she rightfully turned you away from the St. Regis Gala. You were bitter because you did not have a proper invitation to sit with the real power players of Atlanta. So when the most important man in our entire financial portfolio arrived in your emergency room, you saw a golden opportunity. You used a dying man as a prop to enact your petty ghetto revenge against my family. The sheer audacity of his words literally took my breath away. He was rewriting reality right in front of my face. He was taking my absolute professional competence and actively twisting it into a malicious, unhinged narrative. You are completely delusional, I said, keeping my voice dangerously low and highly controlled. I am the charge nurse of the trauma center. I ran that code because it was my job. Your mother endangered his life by screaming for a cardiologist when he needed immediate manual chest compressions. If I had listened to her uneducated demands, Mr. Sterling would be lying in the morgue right now, and your precious wealth management fund would be completely bankrupt. Julian scoffed loudly, waving his hand dismissively as he paced back and forth across the expensive hardwood floor. You always have to be the hero, do not you. You always have to prove that the scrappy working-class girl is somehow smarter than the educated elites. You completely humiliated my mother in front of the hospital administrators. You had hospital security drag her out of the room like she was some common criminal. Do you have any idea how that looks? Do you have any idea how much permanent damage you did to our family aesthetic? Aesthetic, that ridiculous word again. They were entirely obsessed with the surface completely hollow and empty on the inside. Julian stepped right up into my personal space, towering over me, intentionally using his physical size to intimidate me. This is exactly why my mother did not want you at the gala, Maya. You lack restraint. You lack class. You lack the basic understanding of how our world operates. You are an unhinged, jealous woman who cannot handle being around people with actual pedigree. You made a massive scene because you simply wanted to punish my mother for putting you in your place earlier that evening. My mind raced rapidly as I stared up at the man I had agreed to marry. He was gaslighting me with masterful, terrifying precision. If I had been a weaker woman, if I had not spent years building my own impenetrable mental armor, I might have actually started to doubt my own reality. I might have believed that my life-saving actions were somehow rooted in spite. But I knew the absolute truth. I knew my worth. I just needed to let him keep talking, to let him reveal the absolute depths of his cowardice and manipulation. I am waiting for a massive apology, Julian sneered, crossing his arms over his broad chest. I am waiting for you to finally admit that you completely lost control last night. I looked at him with absolute, dead shark-like eyes. I am not apologizing to you or your mother, Julian. I did my job perfectly. His face contorted instantly into a mask of pure, unadulterated rage. His voice dropped to a sinister, highly threatening whisper. You listen to me very carefully, Maya. My family is dealing with a massive financial crisis this morning. Darren and I are frantically trying to keep our major investors from jumping ship now that Mr. Sterling is incapacitated. My mother is currently having a severe nervous breakdown in her bedroom because her flawless reputation is hanging by a thread. We are the victims here, and you are going to make it right. He turned around sharply, snatched his dark suit jacket off the back of the sofa, and aggressively shoved his arms into the sleeves. I want you to go take a shower, put on something highly conservative, and drive your car over to the family mansion at exactly 2 o'clock this afternoon. I crossed my arms tightly, deliberately mirroring his defensive, aggressive posture. And why exactly would I do that? Julian smirked a cruel, arrogant expression that completely erased any lingering trace of the handsome man I thought I loved. Because you are going to march directly into my mother's private study, get down on your knees and formally apologize for your disrespectful, out-of-control behavior. You are going to beg for her forgiveness. You are going to promise that you will never ever humiliate this family again. He paused dramatically, letting the heavy, suffocating silence stretch out before delivering his final crushing blow. And if you refuse, Maya, if you do not show up today and learn your place in this hierarchy, This engagement is completely over. I will not marry a woman who actively tries to destroy my family's legacy out of sheer working-class jealousy. The choice is yours. Show up and prove you can be a respectable wife, or pack your bags and go back to whatever miserable neighborhood you came from. He grabbed his expensive car keys off the granite counter, slammed the heavy front door so hard the apartment walls literally shook and left me standing completely alone in the center of the living room. The silence that followed was incredibly heavy, thick with the poisonous residue of his verbal attack. I did not break down. I did not shed a single tear. The exhaustion that had been weighing down my bones vanished instantly, replaced by a cold, razor-sharp clarity that sharpened all my senses. He thought I was weak. He thought I was desperate to hold on to him and his family's toxic wealth. He genuinely believed that the threat of a broken engagement would bring me to my knees in absolute submission. Julian had spent our entire relationship treating me like a charity case, secretly assuming I would always bow to his superior status when pushed. I walked slowly into the bathroom, turned on the shower, and let the scalding hot water wash away the physical grime of the emergency room. As the thick steam filled the small space, my mind formulated a completely different plan. I realized with absolute certainty that I was currently engaged to a coward, a pathetic man who would gladly sacrifice my professional integrity to soothe his mother's bruised ego. I did not love him anymore. I felt nothing but profound, irreversible disgust. I stepped out of the shower and wrapped a thick white towel around my shoulders. I looked at my reflection in the fogged mirror. I was not going to run away. I was not going to pack my bags and disappear quietly into the night like a defeated victim. I walked into the bedroom and opened my closet doors. Julian had demanded that I wear something conservative. He wanted me to look small, meek, and apologetic. I bypassed the modest sweaters and grabbed a sharp-tailored black dress, the exact kind of outfit you wear when you mean absolute business. I agreed to go to the sprawling family mansion. I agreed to walk right into the lion's den. But I was not going to grovel. I was not going to shed fake tears or beg for Vivian's forgiveness. I was going to observe. I was going to watch them squirm in their frantic desperation, and I was going to find out exactly why they were so terrified of losing Mr. Sterling's money. The gaslighting was over. The real game was just beginning. I grabbed my car keys, my phone, and my badge. I locked the apartment door behind me, feeling an immense surge of power. They thought I was just a nurse. They thought I was blind. By the end of this day, I would show Julian and his mother exactly who they were dealing with. The drive across Atlanta took 45 minutes, taking me deep into the heart of Buckhead, where the towering trees completely hid the massive estates from the main road. I pulled my faded sedan up to the towering wrought iron gates of the family estate. I pressed the intercom button. The heavy gates swung open silently. The driveway was a winding mile of crushed white gravel bordered by perfectly manicured hedges that looked too sharp, too rigid. Everything about this property screamed old money and new secrets. It was a fortress designed to keep the reality of the world out, and their fabricated perfection safely contained inside. I parked my car next to a line of luxury European SUVs, the stark contrast serving as a glaring reminder of exactly what Julian thought of me. He thought I was small. He thought I was desperate. I killed the engine and stepped out into the crisp afternoon air, smoothing down the tailored black dress I had chosen. My medical training had taught me how to compartmentalize trauma, how to completely separate my emotions from the immediate task at hand. I was treating this mansion like a hostile trauma bay. I was looking for the bleed, and I was going to stop it. I walked up the massive stone steps and rang the brass doorbell. The heavy oak door swung open to reveal an older woman in a crisp black and white maid uniform. She looked at me with a mixture of polite indifference and subtle pity. "Miss Maya," the maid said quietly, her eyes darting nervously toward the grand sweeping staircase in the foyer. "Mrs. Vivian is currently receiving her afternoon deep tissue massage in the East Wing. She requested that you wait for her in Mr. Julian's private study until she is completely ready to receive your apology." The sheer audacity of the demand was almost laughable. I had saved their primary investor from clinical death, and Vivian was getting a massage while making me wait to grovel. "Thank you, Maria," I said politely, offering her a warm smile. "I know the way." I walked past her, my heels clicking sharply against the imported Italian marble floor. The house was dead quiet save for the faint sound of classical music drifting down from the upper levels. I navigated the familiar hallways, passing enormous oil paintings of ancestors who looked just as miserable and judgmental as Vivienne. I pushed open the heavy mahogany doors to Julian's private study and stepped inside. The room was a monument to unearned arrogance. Floor-to-ceiling bookshelves held leather-bound volumes that Julian had never bothered to read. A massive ornate globe stood in the corner next to a fully stocked crystal bar cart. The air smelled of expensive scotch and stale cigar smoke. I walked over to the oversized leather executive chair behind his massive desk and sat down. I folded my hands in my lap and simply breathed. I was not nervous. The panic Julian had expected me to feel was entirely absent. I looked around the desk. It was cluttered with legal pads, financial quarterly reports, and half-empty coffee cups. Julian always projected an image of absolute control, but his workspace revealed a chaotic, frantic reality. Right in the center of the dark wood desk sat his personal iPad. It was charging on a sleek metallic stand. I barely paid attention to it at first, my eyes instead scanning a stack of printed emails regarding the wealth management fund. Then the screen suddenly glowed bright white, breaking the dim lighting of the study. A synchronized iMessage notification popped up. Julian used the same Apple ID across all his devices, a careless security flaw I had warned him about months ago. The banner notification lingered on the lock screen. It was a message from Darren, his slick, aggressive brother-in-law. The preview text was completely visible in large, bold letters. It was too suspicious, too incredibly specific to ignore. I leaned forward, my heart beating in a steady, methodical rhythm. The message read exactly like this. "Did the nurse sign the prenup yet? We need her blind to the Sterling accounts." I stared at the glowing letters until they burned into my retinas. The nurse. Not Maya. Not your fiancé. The nurse. And the prenuptial agreement Julian had casually pushed across our kitchen counter last week, claiming it was just a standard family formality, was suddenly cast in a terrifying, sinister new light. I did not cry. I did not gasp. I did not raise a hand to my mouth in shock. The emotional armor I wore every single day in the emergency room locked securely into place, encasing my heart in a solid block of ice. The sadness and betrayal I should have felt were instantly overridden by a cold, calculating clarity. I was not a future bride discovering cold feet. I was a detective who had just stumbled onto a smoking gun. I reached out and tapped the screen. The iPad was completely unlocked. Julian, in his frantic rush to terrorize me this morning, had clearly been reviewing documents and failed to secure the device. I tapped the green message icon and opened the application. There it was at the very top of his inbox, a massive ongoing group chat named The Board. The participants were Julian, Darren, Chloe, and Vivienne. I took a deep breath, steadied my hands, and began scrolling up through the lengthy thread. It was not a family chat sharing dinner plans or holiday photos. It was a digital ledger of pure, unadulterated fraud. The messages dated back months long before Julian had even proposed to me. I scrolled back to October, reading the rapid-fire exchanges between Darren and Julian. Darren wrote, "Sterling is demanding a full audit of his charitable trusts by the end of the year. If he sees the capital transfers we made to cover Chloe's offshore debts, we are entirely ruined. He will pull his $3 million and trigger a federal investigation." Julian responded, "We just need a distraction, something to convince him we are grounded and stable. We need to buy time to move the funds back." Then Vivian chimed in. Her message was a masterclass in manipulation. "Julian, you have been dating that hospital worker for 2 years. Sterling loves the working-class narrative. He started with nothing. If you propose to her, play the devoted family man settling down with a noble, selfless nurse, it will completely charm him. He will delay the audit for a wedding. I felt my lungs restrict, but I forced myself to keep taking slow, even breaths. My entire engagement was a fabricated public relations stunt. The romantic proposal in the botanical gardens, the expensive ring, the promises of a shared future. It was all a calculated, desperate play to manipulate a billionaire's sentimentality and cover up their massive financial embezzlement. I scrolled further down, moving into the messages from just a few weeks ago. Chloe had written, "She is asking too many questions about the wedding budget. Are you sure she will not read the fine print on the prenup? We cannot let her have any legal insight into the family trust." Julian replied, "She is clueless. She works 12-hour shifts and barely has the energy to read a grocery list. I will bury the sterling account clauses in the property division section. She will sign it just to prove she does not care about our money." The sheer arrogance of his words made me grip the edges of the iPad tightly. He thought I was stupid. He thought my exhaustion made me an easy mark. He had severely underestimated the fundamental intelligence required to manage critical trauma patients and calculate complex medication dosages on the fly. I was not clueless. I was focused on saving lives while he was focused on stealing money. I kept scrolling, my eyes devouring every single detail, building a mental map of their entire criminal enterprise. I moved to the messages sent late last night, right around the time Mr. Sterling collapsed at the gala. The panic in the group chat was palpable, reading like a transcript of a sinking ship. Darren had texted in all capital letters, "Sterling just went down. Total collapse. EMS is here. If he dies tonight, the offshore accounts freeze automatically. We do not have the liquid cash to cover the missing $3 million. We go to federal prison, Julian." Vivian's response followed minutes later, frantic and vicious. "We are following the ambulance to Atlanta General. That idiot girl is on shift tonight. Julian, you need to make sure she stays away from him. If she says anything to the hospital administrators about our argument tonight, they might look into his medical proxy. Get down here now." Then came the messages from this morning's sent while I was driving home from my grueling shift. Julian wrote, "She actually saved him. He has a pulse. Sterling is in the catheterization lab. The money is safe for now, but she completely humiliated Mother in the trauma bay." Darren replied, "You need to lock her down immediately. We still need the wedding narrative. Sterling respects her now because she saved his life. You have to force her to apologize to Vivian and sign the prenup today before she figures out the leverage she actually holds." Julian's final message in the thread, sent right before he attacked me in our apartment, was the ultimate confirmation of his cowardice. "I will break her down. She is weak. I will threaten the engagement. She will be crying on her knees in the study by 3 o'clock. I stared at the glowing screen, the damning evidence reflecting in my eyes. They did not just want an apology. They wanted submission. They needed me to be a blind, obedient pawn so they could continue stealing from the very man I had just saved. They needed the noble nurse to legitimize their corrupt, fraudulent existence. I gently set the iPad back onto the metallic charging stand exactly where I had found it. I made sure the screen was positioned perfectly, leaving absolutely no trace of my devastating discovery. I smoothed my black dress and leaned back into the heavy leather chair. I was no longer the heartbroken fiancé trying to understand why her partner was being so cruel. I was the apex predator in the room. Julian wanted me to learn my place. He wanted me to understand the hierarchy of his world. What he completely failed to realize was that my world, the world of the trauma bay, the world of life and death, required a level of strategic brilliance and ruthless execution that his fragile, pampered mind could not even begin to comprehend. I checked the gold watch on my wrist. It was nearly 2:30. Vivian would be finishing her massage soon, expecting a broken, weeping girl to beg for her approval. Julian would be arriving shortly to witness his total domination over my spirit. I stood up and walked over to the crystal bar cart. I poured myself a single glass of sparkling water and took a slow, refreshing sip. I was going to give them exactly what they wanted, an unforgettable performance. I was going to let them believe their toxic manipulation had worked perfectly. I would sign their fraudulent prenuptial agreement. I would apologize to Vivian with absolute convincing sincerity. I would play the role of the submissive, grateful future daughter-in-law flawlessly. I would infiltrate their fortress, secure every piece of evidence they had carelessly documented, And then when they least expected it, I would burn their entire empire to the absolute ground. Let the games begin. But before I could finalize my plan to play the submissive victim, a dark, gnawing intuition pulled my hand right back to the sleek silver device resting on the desk. The glowing screen beckoned with the promise of absolute, unvarnished truth. I picked up Julian's iPad once again, my thumb tapping the screen to bypass the lock before it could time out. I had seen their frantic panic about Mr. Sterling, and I had seen their vile plan to force my submission today, but my medical training demanded a complete diagnostic picture. You do not just treat the visible wound, you look for the underlying disease. I needed to know exactly how deep this rot went. I opened the group chat details and tapped on the shared media and files folder. What I found in the older chat history was a level of cruelty so profound it momentarily robbed the air from my lungs. The financial panic regarding the wealth management fund was recent, but the sheer unadulterated malice directed at me spanned the entire 2 years of my relationship with Julian. I scrolled through hundreds of messages where Julian, Darren, Chloe, and Vivian routinely dissected my humanity for their own twisted entertainment. They did not just look down on my profession, they despised my very existence. The family ruthlessly mocked my dark skin, making vile, racist jokes about how my complexion clashed with the pale, pristine aesthetic of their exclusive country club galas. They ridiculed my natural hair, exchanging laughing emojis over photos Julian had secretly taken of me sleeping, calling my curls unkempt and entirely unsuitable for high society. They laughed endlessly at my working-class background, turning my grueling 12-hour shifts at the hospital into a running punchline. Vivian had sent a message last Thanksgiving stating that I smelled permanently of cheap antiseptic and poverty. And Julian, the man who kissed me every morning and swore he loved my drive, simply replied with a crying, laughing face. But it was a message from Chloe that completely shattered the final lingering illusion of my engagement. Sent just 3 weeks after Julian proposed to me in the botanical gardens, her text was pinned in the chat as some sort of sickening family inside joke. She wrote, "She is useful, a working-class mule who will gladly pay half the mortgage while you live your real life." A working-class mule. I read the words over and over, letting the sheer venom of the insult crystallize my resolve. I was paying half the rent on our luxury midtown apartment. I was buying my own groceries, funding my own car, paying my own way, all while Julian paraded me around as his noble, grounded fiancé to boost his own public image. I was subsidizing the life of a man who viewed me as nothing more than a beast of burden. I exited the message thread and opened a linked folder labeled Sterling Contingency. I tapped on the first spreadsheet, my eyes scanning the intricate rows of financial data. Nursing requires precise mathematics, absolute attention to detail, and the ability to process complex information rapidly. As I analyzed the columns, the grand, terrifying illusion of Julian's family completely collapsed. Vivian and her children were entirely bankrupt. The sprawling, opulent mansion I was currently sitting in was leveraged to the absolute hilt with 3 separate secondary mortgages. The luxury European SUVs in the driveway were all leased. The designer ball gowns and bespoke tuxedos they paraded around in were financed through crippling high-interest credit lines that were severely overdrawn. They had absolutely no liquid assets. Their family wealth was a complete phantom, a hollow shell, propped up by desperate borrowing and sophisticated smoke and mirrors. They were living in a constant state of financial freefall, terrified that their elite peers would discover they were completely destitute. They were poorer than the working-class people they relentlessly mocked, drowning in a sea of toxic debt while desperately trying to keep up appearances. I opened the next file, a series of secure legal documents and wire transfer logs, and the true horrifying nature of their criminal enterprise stared back at me. Darren and Julian were not just failing financial brokers. They were active, prolific felons. They had been using Julian's wealth management firm to systematically launder exactly $3 million directly from Mr. Sterling's charitable foundation. The ledger showed a highly complex web of phantom consulting fees, offshore accounts in the Cayman Islands, and bogus charitable donations funneled straight into Vivian's personal accounts to keep the family afloat. They were literally stealing from sick children and underfunded community projects to pay for their exclusive memberships and emerald necklaces. They had bled the charity dry, which explained their absolute terror when Mr. Sterling flatlined in the trauma bay. If he died, his estate would automatically freeze and audit every single account, instantly exposing their massive theft. But the final document in the folder made my blood run completely cold. It was an email thread between Darren and a shady corporate attorney. I clicked the attachment, reading the dense corporate jargon with razor-sharp focus. It outlined the exact legal structure of the shell companies they had used to siphon Mr. Sterling's money, and listed as the primary director, majority shareholder, and sole liable party for every single one of those fraudulent entities was my name, Maya. The ultimate betrayal slammed into me with the force of a physical blow. The fake romance, the elaborate proposal, the insistence on a quick wedding. It was never just about pacifying Mr. Sterling with a heartwarming story. It was a calculated, highly orchestrated legal trap. They planned to marry the clueless nurse because I worked punishing hours and trusted Julian implicitly. Julian had prepared a mountain of marital paperwork, including the prenuptial agreement he was demanding I sign today, fully intending to bury the shell company ownership transfers deep within the fine print. They were going to quietly put every single stolen dollar, every fraudulent account, and every illegal wire transfer directly into my name. If Mr. Sterling audited his foundation, or if the federal government caught wind of the missing $3 million, the paper trail would lead directly and exclusively to me. Julian and Darren had completely insulated themselves. They were going to frame me for massive corporate embezzlement. I was their designated fall guy. They fully intended to let me take the blame, face the federal investigators, and go to federal prison for decades, while they played the role of the shocked innocent victims and walked away completely clean. I was nothing but a disposable shield to protect their fragile, worthless legacy. I sat in the heavy leather chair, the iPad resting in my hands, surrounded by the suffocating silence of the mansion. The sheer scale of their depravity was almost impossible to process. They had mocked my skin, insulted my heritage, degraded my profession, and planned to steal my absolute freedom. They looked at a woman who dedicated her entire life to saving others and saw only a sacrificial lamb for their own bottomless greed. My hands moved with swift mechanical precision. I pulled my personal cell phone out of my pocket. I opened the camera application and began photographing every single piece of evidence on the iPad screen. I took high-resolution pictures of the group chat, ensuring the dates, timestamps, and contact names were perfectly legible. I photographed Chloe's racist insults, Vivian's manipulative directives, and Julian's cowardly compliance. Then I moved to the files, capturing the bankrupt balance sheets, the offshore wire transfer logs, and the draft documents placing the fraudulent shell companies in my name. I took dozens of pictures, creating a complete, undeniable digital archive of their entire criminal conspiracy. Once I had captured everything, I immediately opened my email application and sent the entire batch of photographs directly to my secure personal cloud storage account. I deleted the sent email from my phone, ensuring the evidence was safely locked away in a digital vault they could never access or destroy. I carefully closed the files on Julian's iPad, swiped away the application history, and set the device back onto the charging stand exactly as I had found it. The screen went black, hiding the toxic secrets within. I slipped my phone back into my pocket and smoothed the fabric of my tailored black dress. My heart was not racing. My hands were not shaking. The woman who had walked into this study looking for answers was gone forever. In her place was a surgical instrument of absolute ruin. I knew their secrets. I knew their crimes. I held the keys to their federal indictments right in my pocket. Julian wanted me to bow down. Vivian wanted me to grovel. They wanted the working-class mule to accept her burden. I was going to give them the greatest performance of my entire life, and when the curtain finally fell, there would be absolutely nothing left of them but ashes. Right on cue, the heavy mahogany doors of the study clicked open. I arranged my face into a perfect mask of quiet, submissive contemplation. I looked up, entirely ready to play my part. Julian stepped fully into the room, closing the heavy mahogany doors behind him with a definitive, echoing thud. He was wearing a fresh, impeccably tailored navy suit, his dark hair perfectly styled, and his posture radiating absolute arrogance. He looked like a man who had just conquered the world, thoroughly convinced of his own untouchable superiority. He expected to see a broken woman. He fully anticipated finding me hunched over his desk, tears tracking through my makeup, my shoulders slumped in total devastating defeat. I remained seated in his oversized leather executive chair for a fraction of a second longer, my mind rapidly cataloging the digital arsenal I had just compiled. Working with the quick, silent precision of a trauma nurse in a crisis, I had already taken out my phone and photographed all 47 pages of the text thread, the offshore bank transfers, and the fake LLC registrations. I had successfully emailed every single damning image to a highly secure encrypted external server. The weapon was fully loaded. The safety was completely off. The fraudulent empire his family had built on credit and lies was now entirely in my possession. Julian leaned casually against the door frame, crossing his arms over his broad chest. A cruel, triumphant smirk played across his lips. Well, he began, his voice dripping with suffocating condescension. My mother is waiting in the parlor. I trust you had enough time in here to reflect on your absolute lack of judgment and your embarrassing ghetto behavior. Are you ready to go apologize and beg for your place back in this family? I stood up slowly, smoothing the sharp lines of my tailored black dress. I did not arrange my face into an apology. The submissive mask I had initially planned to wear completely evaporated, replaced by a cold, razor-sharp reality. I simply stared at him with dead, shark-like eyes. There was no warmth left in my gaze. There was no lingering affection for the man I had once agreed to marry. There was only the absolute terrifying certainty of a predator staring at prey that did not yet realize it was caught in an inescapable trap. What is wrong with you? Julian snapped, his arrogant smirk faltering slightly as he registered the complete absence of fear in my posture. Wipe that look off your face, Maya. You are walking on incredibly thin ice right now. Do not test my patience. I walked deliberately around the edge of the massive wooden desk, my heels silent on the plush Persian rug. I closed the distance between us until I was standing barely a foot away from him. He clearly expected me to reach out to grab his hands to plead for his protection and forgiveness. Instead, I looked him dead in the center of his eyes, keeping my voice dangerously low and chillingly steady. I do not think I have an apology in me today. Julian physically recoiled, taking a sharp half-step backward, as if I had just struck him across his perfectly shaven face. Excuse me, what did you just say to me? You heard exactly what I said, Julian. I am not apologizing to your mother. I am not apologizing to you. I am completely done. His handsome face twisted into an ugly, volatile mask of pure, unadulterated rage. You stupid, arrogant girl, he hissed, his hands balling into tight fists at his sides. If you walk out that door without getting on your knees and begging my mother for forgiveness, this engagement is permanently over. You will get absolutely nothing. You will be nothing. You will go right back to being a pathetic, overworked nobody. I let out a short, hollow laugh that echoed sharply off the vaulted ceilings of his precious study. I am already nothing to you, Julian. I always have been. I did not wait for his response. I bypassed him completely, pushing my shoulder aggressively past his chest and pulling the heavy mahogany door wide open. I marched straight down the marble hallway, the sound of my heels echoing like rhythmic gunshots through the silent, oppressive mansion. I heard Julian shouting my name behind me, his voice cracking with fury, demanding that I come back, threatening to ruin my entire life. But his voice sounded tiny, cowardly, and utterly pathetic. I reached the massive front door, yanked it open, and stepped out into the crisp, unforgiving afternoon air. I got into my faded sedan, locked the doors, and drove rapidly down the winding gravel driveway. As the towering iron gates closed behind me, I felt an immense, intoxicating rush of pure adrenaline. The trap was officially set. Now I just had to wait for them to make their desperate next move. They did not wait long. Vivian Sterling was a woman who operated strictly on brutal, calculated vengeance, and she possessed a terrifying amount of social and financial influence in Atlanta. She was absolutely furious at my defiance. She was enraged that the working-class nurse had dared to walk out of her pristine mansion without bowing to her manufactured elite authority. I knew she would strike back, but I severely underestimated the sheer speed and viciousness of her retaliation. The next morning, I woke up in the silent bedroom of my apartment. Julian had not come home. His side of the bed was perfectly made, completely undisturbed. I sat at my small kitchen counter, sipping a cup of black coffee, feeling a strange, hollow sense of peace. I was a free woman. I opened my laptop to check my personal email, fully intending to begin the meticulous process of contacting a federal whistleblower attorney with the 47 pages of evidence I had secured on my cloud server. A bold red notification sat at the very top of my inbox, flagged with high importance. The sender was the Atlanta General Hospital Board of Directors and the State Medical Ethics Committee. The subject line read, "Urgent notice of immediate disciplinary action and professional license suspension." My heart slammed violently against my ribs, a sudden spike of adrenaline flooding my veins. I clicked the email and began reading the dense legalistic text. The words blurred together for a fraction of a second before snapping into horrifying, undeniable focus. Vivian had completely bypassed standard hospital protocol. She had pulled every single influential string she had using her status as the prominent wife of a major hospital donor to file a formal, expedited, and highly devastating complaint directly with the highest level of hospital administration and the state nursing board. The complaint ruthlessly alleged that I had physically assaulted her in the emergency room trauma bay. It explicitly claimed that I had displayed gross medical negligence by aggressively and violently pushing her out of the room while Mr. Sterling was experiencing a critical cardiac event. She had submitted a highly fabricated dramatic narrative stating that my unhinged, violent behavior had directly endangered a high-profile patient's life and severely traumatized his close family friends. The email stated that Vivian had demanded an immediate full-scale investigation into my professional competence and mental stability. The email concluded with a crushing, devastating blow. Pending a formal emergency hearing before the Hospital Ethics Committee and the State Medical Board, my nursing license was instantly suspended. Effective immediately, I was completely barred from stepping foot on hospital property. My badge was deactivated. I was stripped of my title, my hard-earned income, and my entire professional identity with a single malicious keystroke. I sat in the quiet kitchen, the harsh glow of the laptop screen illuminating my shocked, still face. They had gone straight for my jugular. They knew exactly how much my career meant to me. They knew I had spent years of grueling study, countless sleepless nights, and endless brutal shifts building my reputation as an elite, deeply capable trauma nurse. Vivian and Julian had systematically targeted the only thing in my entire life that I actually valued more than my relationship with him. This was their ultimate, desperate power play. They genuinely believed that by destroying my livelihood, they would force me into absolute groveling submission. They thought that without my nursing license, without my steady income, and facing the terrifying prospect of permanent professional ruin, I would have absolutely no choice but to come crawling back to their gated mansion. They expected me to beg for Julian to take me back and plead for Vivian to retract her fraudulent complaint. They wanted to starve me out to break my spirit so completely that I would gladly sign their criminal prenuptial agreement and accept the role of their designated fall guy just to survive the week. I stood up and walked over to the kitchen window looking out over the busy, indifferent Atlanta streets below. A profound, terrifying silence settled over my racing mind. The initial shock evaporated instantly, replaced by a brilliant, blinding rage. They had just made a fatal, irreversible miscalculation. By filing a formal complaint and demanding an emergency board hearing, Vivian had unknowingly created a highly publicized official and legally binding forum. She wanted to publicly humiliate me in front of the hospital administrators. She wanted to stand in front of a committee of elite doctors, hospital executives, and state board members to paint me as a deranged, negligent working-class girl who lacked the pedigree to handle high-pressure medical situations. I walked back to my laptop and pulled up the encrypted server containing my 47 pages of absolute undeniable proof. The offshore bank transfers, the fraudulent LLC registrations bearing my forged signature, the terrifying text messages explicitly detailing their plan to use Mr. Sterling's medical crisis to cover up their massive $3 million theft. I was not going to cower in my apartment. I was not going to shed a single tear over my suspended license. I was going to walk into that disciplinary hearing, face the entire hospital board, look Vivian directly in the eye, and drop a nuclear bomb on the Sterling Wealth Management Fund. Vivian thought she was bringing a disciplined, apologetic nurse to a professional slaughter. She had absolutely no idea she had just invited an apex predator directly into the room. The official summons arrived via courier barely 24 hours later, demanding my immediate presence at a formal disciplinary hearing. I walked through the sliding glass doors of the executive suite on the 20th floor of Atlanta General, bypassing the whispering receptionists and stepping directly into the massive glass-enclosed boardroom. The room was designed to intimidate. Floor-to-ceiling windows offered a dizzying panoramic view of the Atlanta skyline, while a massive mahogany table dominated the center of the space, polished to a mirror shine. I took my seat at the far end of the table, entirely alone. I brought no legal counsel. I brought no union representative. I simply placed my sleek black leather portfolio on the smooth wood in front of me and folded my hands over it. Sitting directly across from me, clustered together like a pack of perfectly groomed wolves, were Vivian, Julian, and Darren. They had brought an entire team of high-priced corporate lawyers who were currently busy arranging thick, intimidating binders filled with what I could only assume were fabricated affidavits and legal threats. Julian wore a sharp charcoal suit, entirely avoiding my gaze, choosing instead to intensely study a silver pen in his hands. Darren leaned back in his chair with a sickening, predatory smirk, looking me up and down as if I were a piece of trash that had blown in off the street. At the head of the table sat Dr. Eris Thorne. The chief of medicine. Flanking him were the director of human resources and the chief hospital administrator. They all looked incredibly nervous, sweating visibly under the intense pressure of the Sterling family's presence. Atlanta General relied heavily on private endowments, and Vivian had spent the last decade making sure every executive in this room believed her family was the hospital's most lucrative benefactor. Dr. Thorne cleared his throat, adjusting his glasses with trembling fingers. We are gathered here today to review a highly serious expedited grievance filed by the Sterling family regarding an incident of alleged physical assault and gross medical malfeasance in Trauma Bay 4. Vivian did not even wait for him to finish his introductory remarks. She seized the floor with the practiced, seamless execution of a seasoned stage actress. She leaned forward, resting her perfectly manicured hands on the table, and let a single masterful tear slip down her cheek. Dr. Thorne. Vivian began, her voice trembling with manufactured trauma and delicate fragility. I have been a patron of this hospital for over 15 years. I have trusted this institution with my family's health and our philanthropy. But what I experienced 2 nights ago at the hands of this woman was a waking nightmare. She paused, lifting a monogrammed silk handkerchief to dab delicately at the corners of her dry eyes. My dear close friend suffered a massive cardiac event. Vivian continued, her voice hitching perfectly on cue. I followed the ambulance here, terrified for his life. I stepped into the trauma bay simply to offer comfort, to be a familiar face for a dying man. But Maya did not see a grieving friend. She saw an opportunity for petty, unhinged revenge. She was angry with me over a minor social misunderstanding at a charity gala earlier that evening. She let her working-class jealousy completely override her medical duty. I sat completely motionless, my face a mask of stone. I watched her performance not with anger, but with the cold, detached observation of a clinician diagnosing a severe psychiatric disorder. She was weaving a masterpiece of absolute fiction. She turned into an animal, Vivian sobbed, pointing a shaking finger directly at my face. She screamed at me. She physically shoved me against the medical carts, bruising my shoulder. She ignored my frantic requests to bring in a specialized cardiologist, choosing instead to violently assault Mr. Sterling's chest with her bare hands. She used his fragile, dying body as a prop to assert her authority and punish me. She completely lost her mind. She endangered a beloved billionaire's life simply because she felt socially inferior to my family. The chief administrator nodded sympathetically, sliding a box of tissues across the table toward Vivian. I watched the hospital executives silently swallow every single drop of her toxic poison. They were not looking at me as their elite charge nurse. They were looking at me as a massive financial liability. Julian finally spoke up, perfectly playing his assigned role in their twisted production. He looked at the board members with an expression of profound, heartbroken disappointment. "I have to apologize to this board," Julian said, his voice dripping with fake remorse. "I brought Maya into my world. I was blinded by what I thought was her dedication to her job. But my mother is telling the exact truth. Maya has always harbored a deeply unsettling, volatile resentment toward people of our pedigree. She lacks the emotional restraint and the basic education required to function in high-pressure, elite environments. When she saw my mother in that room, her personal vendetta completely hijacked her professional judgment. She is a danger to this hospital." Before I could even register the absolute cowardice of his statement, Darren leaned aggressively over the table, signaling his legal team to take the reins. A silver-haired attorney in a bespoke pinstripe suit stood up, resting his knuckles on the mahogany wood, projecting immense, suffocating authority. "Let us be absolutely clear about the legal exposure this hospital is currently facing," the lawyer boomed, his voice echoing off the glass walls. "What we are discussing here is not a simple breach of protocol. This is criminal battery. This is tortious interference with a patient's designated medical proxy. We are looking at gross malfeasance and fiduciary endangerment. My clients were subjected to unprovoked, targeted violence by a rogue employee who actively violated the most basic tenets of the Hippocratic Oath to satisfy a ghetto revenge fantasy." Darren smirked, picking up the thread and spinning it tighter deliberately, using dense corporate and legal jargon designed to make me feel small, uneducated, and entirely out of my depth. "You see, Maya," Darren sneered, mispronouncing my name intentionally. "In the real world, the world of actual power and consequence, you cannot just assault high-net-worth individuals because you feel marginalized by your socioeconomic status. You lack the fundamental cognitive capacity to understand elite medical directives. You displayed a total, catastrophic failure of risk management. We are fully prepared to file a multi-million-dollar civil suit against Atlanta General for harboring a violently unstable employee, and we will absolutely press criminal charges for the physical battery of my mother." The lawyers began opening their binders, sliding glossy, professionally printed documents across the table toward the hospital administrators. They were bearing the truth under an avalanche of expensive paper and terrifying legal threats. They wanted the board to feel the crushing weight of their fabricated wealth. They were explicitly framing me as a rogue, uneducated liability who simply could not comprehend the sophisticated needs of wealthy patients. "We demand immediate, permanent termination," the lead attorney stated, crossing his arms and glaring at the board. "We demand the permanent revocation of her nursing license. If she is removed from this premises today quietly and immediately, the Sterling family will graciously decline to pursue the civil litigation that would undoubtedly bankrupt this entire institution." I looked at Dr. Thorne. I had worked alongside him for 4 years. I had saved his surgical patients when they crashed in the middle of the night. I had caught medication errors made by his residents that would have resulted in massive malpractice suits. I waited for him to speak up. I waited for him to ask for my clinical chart, to review the telemetry data from Mr. Sterling's code, to ask me for my medical defense. Instead, Dr. Thorne looked down at his hands, his face pale with absolute cowardice. He glanced nervously at the chief administrator, who gave him a rapid, definitive nod. The decision had been made before I even walked into the room. They were terrified. They were looking at the furious, demanding faces of the Sterling family and seeing the potential loss of their annual charity gala funding. They were choosing the illusion of elite wealth over the absolute reality of medical integrity. Maya, the HR director, said, her voice shaking slightly as she pulled a thick stack of stapled papers from her folder. Given the extreme severity of these allegations and the corroborating statements from the Sterling family, the hospital board has decided that your continued employment poses an unacceptable risk to this institution. She did not look me in the eye. None of the hospital executives did. They stared at the polished mahogany table, actively participating in my professional execution to save their own comfortable salaries. We have drafted a severance and non-disclosure agreement. The HR director continued sliding the heavy stack of papers across the long table until it stopped directly in front of my hands. This agreement stipulates your immediate voluntary resignation. It includes a full admission of fault regarding the incident with Mrs. Sterling. In exchange for your signature today, the family has agreed to withhold criminal charges. If you refuse to sign, we will terminate you with cause. We will support the criminal battery investigation, and we will actively testify against you at the state nursing board to ensure you never practice medicine in this country again. A heavy, suffocating silence fell over the glass boardroom. I looked across the table. Vivian was dabbing her dry eyes, a faint, triumphant smile playing on her lips. Julian was staring at me with a look of absolute arrogant victory, genuinely believing he had finally broken me. Darren was leaning back, checking his expensive watch, completely bored by the destruction of my life. They had boxed me in perfectly. They had used their fake wealth to terrorize my employers, manipulated the legal system to threaten my freedom, and orchestrated my total professional ruin in less than 48 hours. They expected me to reach for the pen. They expected me to start crying, to beg for my job, to realize that the scrappy working-class girl could never ever win against the untouchable educated elites. They were waiting for me to sign my entire life away just to escape the terrifying wrath of the Sterling family. I looked down at the termination papers resting on the table. I did not reach for the pen. I did not cry. I placed my hands flat on the polished mahogany wood, feeling the cold, hard surface beneath my palms. I slowly raised my head, locking my eyes directly onto Vivian's smug, victorious face. The clinical observation was officially over. It was time for the absolute destruction to begin. The suffocating silence stretched across the polished mahogany table. I kept my face entirely devoid of emotion, offering them absolutely nothing. No tears, no trembling lips, no frantic pleas for mercy. The hospital administrators shifted uncomfortably in their ergonomic chairs, exchanging nervous glances. They were visibly unsettled by the fact that the working-class nurse was not already weeping and begging for her career. Julian sensed the slight shift in the room's energy. He was a master of reading a room, of manipulating the narrative before it could slip through his fingers. He stood up, buttoning his tailored suit jacket with a practiced, elegant motion. He raised a hand, signaling the high-priced lawyers to hold their fire. "Dr. Thorne, if you would allow me just a moment," Julian said, his voice dropping an octave to convey a deep, manufactured sorrow. "I know Maya better than anyone here. I believe she is simply overwhelmed by the gravity of this situation. I would like 5 minutes alone with her, just to explain the reality of her choices, woman to man. I think I can make her see reason without dragging this institution through a messy termination process." Dr. Thorne looked visibly relieved, nodding eagerly. "Of course, Julian. We will take a brief recess." Julian walked around the massive table and placed a gentle, guiding hand on my shoulder. My skin crawled at his touch, but I allowed him to guide me out of the heavy glass doors and into the plush carpeted hallway outside the executive suite. The thick soundproofing immediately cut off the ambient noise of the boardroom, leaving us in a tense, isolated silence. The instant the door clicked shut, Julian dropped the aggressive, vindictive act he had displayed in our apartment. He seamlessly transitioned into his favorite role, the benevolent, exhausted savior. He let out a long, heavy sigh, running a hand through his perfectly styled dark hair. He looked down at me with an expression of profound, fake pity. "Maya, I am trying to save you," Julian began, his voice dripping with condescension. "I really am. You have to understand that you are completely out of your depth here. You let your emotions get the better of you, And you picked a fight with a family that can crush you without a second thought. My mother is furious, and Darren wants to see you in a jail cell, but I still care about you. I do not want to see your life completely ruined because of one stupid, jealous mistake. I stared at him, my expression completely blank, letting him dig his grave deeper with every single word. He reached inside the breast pocket of his tailored suit jacket and pulled out a sleek silver folder. He opened it and pulled out a crisp legal document completely separate from the hospital's termination papers. I convinced Darren's legal team to draft this, Julian said, holding the paper up. This is a non-disclosure agreement. It is a very simple, very standard contract. It formally dissolves our engagement quietly, without any messy public spectacle. It explicitly waives your right to any of our family assets, properties, or trusts. And most importantly, it legally binds you to strict permanent silence regarding anything you may have heard, seen, or assumed about our family's finances. I looked at the document, the pieces of their entire criminal conspiracy clicking together in my mind with absolute terrifying clarity. The NDA was not about my alleged assault on Vivian. The NDA was the entire point of this elaborate, terrifying ambush. They knew I had been living with Julian. They knew I had access to his study. They were terrified that I might have overheard a phone call or seen a bank statement that exposed their massive $3 million fraud. They needed me legally gagged before they could safely dump the stolen charity funds into the shell companies registered in my name. They were using the threat of my nursing license to blackmail me into signing away my right to defend myself against federal embezzlement charges. Julian stepped closer, invading my personal space, lowering his voice to a threatening, sinister whisper. Sign this, Maya. Sign this contract right now. It dissolves our engagement, quietly waives your right to any of our assets, and prevents you from ever talking about our family's finances. If you sign it, my mother will immediately drop the medical complaint. You get to keep your little nursing license. You get to walk away, go back to your miserable shifts, and we never have to see each other again. But if you do not sign it, Maya, if you decide to be stubborn and fight us, we will absolutely bury you in legal fees. We will drag this out until you are bankrupt. We will make sure the medical board permanently revokes your license, and we will make sure you never work in healthcare again. The choice is yours: survival or total destruction. Keep your little nursing license. The sheer arrogance of his words echoed in my mind. He thought my license was a trivial, pathetic little hobby. He had absolutely no comprehension of the blood, the sweat, the grueling clinical hours, and the actual human lives that license represented. He thought he could leverage my entire life's work to cover up his pathetic, desperate theft. I understand the terms perfectly, I said, my voice completely devoid of emotion. Julian let out a breath, a smug, victorious smile creeping back onto his handsome face. He genuinely believed he had won. He genuinely believed that the poor, uneducated girl had finally realized she was completely powerless against the mighty Sterling family. Good, Julian said, turning back toward the boardroom. Let us go put an end to this. He pushed the heavy glass doors open and guided me back into the executive suite. The atmosphere inside the room was thick and oppressive, heavy, with the suffocating weight of elitist arrogance. The hospital administrators looked up expectantly, their faces tight with anxiety. Vivian was checking her flawless makeup in a silver compact mirror, clearly bored by the delay. Darren sat leaning back in his chair, tapping a gold pen against the mahogany table with an arrogant, rhythmic beat. The high-priced lawyers looked at me with open, undisguised contempt, ready to finalize the slaughter of my career. Julian guided me back to my seat at the far end of the massive table. He walked over to Darren's lead attorney and handed him the silver folder. The lawyer nodded slickly, extracting the non-disclosure agreement and sliding it directly across the polished wood until it rested perfectly in front of my hands. He placed a heavy, gold-plated fountain pen right next to the signature line. We have reached an understanding, Julian announced to the board, taking his seat next to his mother. Maya has agreed to sign a comprehensive non-disclosure agreement with our family. Upon her signature, my mother has graciously agreed to formally withdraw her complaint regarding the assault and the medical negligence. Maya will retain her employment and her license, and this unfortunate incident will be permanently closed. Dr. Thorne let out a massive audible sigh of relief, his shoulders slumping. The chief administrator smiled weakly, thrilled that the hospital's primary funding source was no longer threatening a multi-million-dollar lawsuit. They did not care about the truth. They did not care that one of their best trauma nurses was being actively blackmailed in their own boardroom. They only cared about their bottom line. The pressure cooker environment of the boardroom intensified, bearing down on me with a crushing, suffocating physical weight. Every single eye in the room was locked directly onto me. The elite family, their ruthless lawyers, and the cowardly hospital executives were all staring, waiting in absolute silence for the grand finale. They were waiting for the poor, uneducated, working-class girl to finally break down. They wanted to see the tears fall. They wanted to see my hands shake. They wanted the supreme satisfaction of watching me sign away my rights, my voice, and my dignity just to survive the week. The silence stretched out, broken only by the steady, rhythmic ticking of the expensive antique clock mounted on the far wall. Tick, tick, tick. It was the sound of my future hanging in the absolute balance. Darren leaned forward, resting his elbows on the table, a cruel, impatient sneer twisting his features. "We do not have all day, Maya. Sign the document. Take the deal. Go back to your little life." I looked down at the thick premium paper resting in front of me. I read the bold, aggressive legal jargon, explicitly demanding my absolute silence regarding the Sterling Family Wealth Management Fund. I looked at the gold-plated pen resting beside it. I let the heavy, suffocating anticipation fill every single corner of the glass boardroom. They had spent 2 years treating me like an uneducated prop, a temporary amusement to boost their public relations mule, to carry their financial burdens, and ultimately, a convenient scapegoat for their massive federal crimes. They believed their wealth, their status, and their cruel intimidation tactics had successfully cornered me into absolute submission. They genuinely thought the trap had closed flawlessly around my neck. I stared down at the crisp white paper that was designed to seal my fate and silence my voice forever. Slowly, deliberately, I reached my hand forward. My fingers were completely steady. My pulse was entirely calm. I picked up the pen. I held it perfectly steady, hovering less than an inch over the bold black line that demanded my signature. I held it right over the paper. The heavy gold-plated pen felt cold and foreign between my fingers. Every single person in the glass boardroom held their breath. They were leaning forward, their greedy, expectant eyes glued to my hand. They wanted the signature. They desperately needed that signature to save their fraudulent, crumbling empire. The silence stretched out thick, oppressive, and suffocating. I looked down at the bold black line. Then I simply opened my fingers. The expensive fountain pen dropped. It hit the polished mahogany table with a sharp, definitive clatter. The sound echoed like a gunshot in the tense, sterile room. The collective gasp from the legal team was audible. I did not break eye contact with Julian. I watched the arrogant, victorious smirk completely freeze on his handsome face. His confident posture shattered in real time, rapidly replaced by a sudden, creeping terror. Using just my index finger, I slowly and deliberately pushed the non-disclosure agreement back across the table. It slid over the smooth wood until it bumped directly against Darren's perfectly manicured hands. I took a deep, steadying breath, feeling the absolute power of the truth surging through my veins. "I do not negotiate with criminals," I said, my voice ringing out with crystal-clear precision. The reaction was instantaneous and violently explosive. The carefully constructed elite facade of the Sterling family shattered into a million jagged pieces. Julian took a stumbling step back, his mouth opening and closing in absolute stunned silence. The color completely drained from his face as he realized his ultimate leverage had just failed. Darren lunged forward, grabbing the rejected contract as if it had suddenly caught fire, his eyes darting frantically toward the hospital executives. But it was Vivian who completely lost her mind. The delicate weeping victim routine vanished instantly. The mask of the refined society matron dropped entirely, revealing the desperate, vicious, cornered animal underneath. She slammed both her hands down on the table and shot up from her chair. Her face turned a violent mottled shade of crimson. Her designer pearls clattered aggressively against the mahogany wood. "Call security!" Vivian shrieked, her voice echoing shrilly off the glass walls, entirely devoid of her usual polished grace. "Call the police right now and have this deranged woman arrested. I want her escorted out of this building in handcuffs. She is a violent, unstable threat." She turned her furious, wild gaze to Dr. Thorne and the hospital administrators, who were visibly shrinking back into their ergonomic chairs. "Terminate her immediately. I demand you fire her on the spot. If she is not stripped of her credentials and thrown out onto the street this very second, I will withdraw every single cent of our funding. I will personally ruin this hospital. I will see to it that none of you ever work in Atlanta again." The boardroom descended into absolute, unmanageable chaos. Darren's lawyers began shouting rapid legal threats over Vivian's hysterical screaming, aggressively attempting to bully the board into compliance through sheer volume and intimidation. The HR director frantically reached for the landline phone on the table, her hands shaking violently as she prepared to call hospital security to have me forcibly removed. Julian glared at me with pure, unadulterated hatred, his fists clenched so tightly his knuckles were white. They were throwing everything they had at me, a desperate, deafening barrage of intimidation. I remained seated perfectly still, perfectly calm, watching their fake empire begin to burn. Before the HR director could even lift the phone receiver from its cradle, a sharp, authoritative sound cut through the deafening pandemonium. The heavy double mahogany doors of the boardroom did not just open, they were pushed wide open with such commanding, terrifying force that they slammed loudly against the glass walls. The resulting boom echoed through the executive suite like thunder. The entire room froze. Vivian's shrill screaming abruptly cut off. The high-priced lawyers stopped mid-sentence. Julian spun around. Everyone turned to look at the entrance. Standing in the doorway was a vision of absolute, undeniable authority. It was a stunning, fiercely commanding black woman who appeared to be in her mid-30s. She radiated an aura of genuine, effortless power that instantly made the Sterling family's manufactured wealth look like a cheap, desperate illusion. She was dressed in a razor-sharp, bespoke crimson power suit that fit her with immaculate precision. Her posture was flawless, her expression completely unbothered, and her dark, intelligent eyes swept across the chaotic boardroom with cold, calculating authority. She stepped into the room, the sharp, deliberate click of her designer heels echoing in the sudden, suffocating silence. It was Nia Sterling. The reaction from the hospital executives was instantaneous and absolutely pathetic. Dr. Thorne, the chief administrator, and the HR director physically jumped out of their chairs. They stood at absolute terrified attention, their faces draining of all remaining color. They looked like terrified schoolchildren who had just been caught committing a terrible crime. They were not standing out of basic professional courtesy. They were standing out of pure, unadulterated fear. Nia Sterling was not just the beloved daughter of the billionaire patient currently recovering in the intensive care unit. She was a ruthless, legendary force in the global financial world. She was the founder and CEO of a massive, heavily capitalized private equity firm. And as the terrified, sweating faces of the hospital executives confirmed, her firm had just recently finalized the acquisition of a majority stake in this exact hospital system. She was not merely a generous donor. She did not just politely contribute to the annual charity galas like Vivian pretended to do. Nia literally owned the building. She owned the board of directors. She owned their contracts, their pensions, and their entire professional futures. She was the absolute boss of their bosses. The sheer magnitude of her presence sucked all the oxygen out of the room. Nia walked slowly, deliberately toward the head of the table. Her gaze locked dead onto Vivian, who was still standing with her mouth slightly open, her raised hand frozen in midair. The heavy, oppressive tension in the room had completely shifted. The vicious predators who had confidently cornered me in this glass box were suddenly realizing they were the ones trapped inside the cage. Nia stopped at the edge of the mahogany table, looking down at the scattered legal documents, the terrified executives, and finally, at the rejected non-disclosure agreement. She slowly looked up, her piercing gaze moving systematically from Darren to Julian, and finally resting on Vivian's pale, shocked face. The true owner of the room had arrived. Nia Sterling did not just walk into the room. She consumed it entirely. She moved with the fluid, lethal grace of a woman who was accustomed to shifting global markets and destroying massive corporate empires before breakfast. The hospital executives immediately scrambled to get out of her way. Dr. Thorne practically tripped over his own expensive ergonomic chair in his desperate haste to stand at attention. Vivienne attempted to recover her footing. She plastered on her sickly sweet high society smile and stepped forward, her hands outstretched in a grotesque display of manufactured warmth. "Nia, darling." Vivienne cooed, her voice trembling slightly, but fighting for control. "It is an absolute tragedy about your father. We have been praying non-stop. We are just in the middle of dealing with this highly unstable nurse who aggressively assaulted me while he was coding. We have the situation entirely under control, I assure you." Nia did not look at Vivian's outstretched hands. She looked directly at Vivian's face with an expression of absolute freezing disgust. "Sit down, Vivian," Nia commanded. Her voice was not loud, but it possessed a razor-sharp edge that sliced straight through the heavy tension in the boardroom. Vivian blinked rapidly, her smile faltering as her hand dropped to her side. "Excuse me." "I said sit down," Nia repeated, stepping up to the head of the polished mahogany table. She reached into the pocket of her tailored crimson jacket and pulled out a small metallic USB drive. She slammed it down onto the center of the table. The sharp, aggressive crack made Julian physically flinch. Nia turned her piercing gaze to the terrified hospital administrators who were currently holding their collective breath. "My private security team pulled the raw, unedited surveillance footage from the hotel ballroom where my father collapsed," Nia stated, her voice dropping to a lethal, echoing whisper. "There are high-definition cameras positioned directly above the main foyer." Nia leaned forward, locking eyes with Vivian, whose face was rapidly losing all of its color. "When my father hit the floor holding his chest, it was not an immediate medical response." Nia continued, her words landing like physical blows. "The footage clearly shows the hotel manager grabbing his radio to call for an ambulance. And it shows you Vivian physically grabbing the manager's arm. It shows you aggressively pulling him aside and explicitly ordering him to delay the emergency call for 10 minutes. You looked him dead in the eye and told him that having paramedics rushing through the main doors with a stretcher would cause a scene and completely ruin the aesthetic of your charity gala." A collective horrifying gasp swept through the glass boardroom. Dr. Thorne stared at Vivian in absolute, unadulterated disbelief. The HR director covered her mouth with her hands, her eyes wide with shock. "You prioritized a champagne reception and a string quartet over my father's life," Nia stated, her tone devoid of any mercy. "If this nurse had not ignored your ridiculous narcissistic orders, shoved past you and initiated chest compressions immediately, my father would be lying in a morgue right now, instead of the intensive care unit. Maya is the absolute only reason he is breathing today." Vivian collapsed heavily into her chair, her mouth opening and closing soundlessly like a suffocating fish. The high-priced, silver-haired attorneys, who had been aggressively barking threats just moments ago, suddenly began furiously packing up their binders. They realized instantly that they were standing on the wrong side of a very dangerous, very public massacre, and their retainer was not nearly high enough to cover this level of legal exposure. The entire room sat in paralyzed, suffocating shock. The air was thick with the horrifying realization of Vivian's monstrous vanity. But I was not finished. The surgical precision of my revenge was only half complete. They had brought me into this room to destroy my life, and I fully intended to return the favor. I stood up from my chair at the far end of the table. I picked up my cell phone, walking calmly and deliberately toward the massive state-of-the-art 80-inch presentation screen mounted on the boardroom wall. "Since we are sharing footage today, I said, my voice cutting cleanly through the stunned silence. Let us take a detailed look at the Sterling family finances. I pulled a connector cable from the digital podium, plugged it directly into my phone, and tapped the screen. The massive projector whirred to life, casting a bright, unforgiving glow across the darkened room. Julian suddenly leaped from his chair, his eyes widening in pure, unfiltered panic. He finally understood exactly what I was doing. Maya, stop. Do not do this. We can talk about this. We can make a deal. Sit down, Julian. Nia snapped, her voice cracking like a whip. Julian froze instantly, terror locking his joints, and slowly sank back into his seat. The enormous screen illuminated the boardroom. I brought up the secure cloud folder and opened the first piece of evidence. It was a high-resolution screenshot of the Sterling family group chat. For the past 2 years, the Sterling family has subjected me to relentless emotional abuse, I explained, gesturing to the glowing screen. They ruthlessly mocked my skin color, my natural hair, and my working-class background for their own private entertainment. But this specific message from Chloe Sterling is particularly enlightening regarding their true motives. I zoomed in on the text message. The cruel words filled the 80-inch screen in undeniable glaring detail. She is useful, a working-class mule who will gladly pay half the mortgage while you live your real life. I swiped seamlessly to the next slide. I was not just subsidizing Julian's luxury lifestyle, I stated, my voice echoing with clinical detached authority. I was the designated fall guy for a massive, highly orchestrated criminal enterprise. I opened the offshore wire transfer logs and the highly classified bank statements. The intricate rows of undeniable financial data glowed brightly for the entire room to see. Darren's face instantly drained of all blood. He looked like a man who was actively experiencing a massive coronary event. He gripped the edge of the mahogany table, his knuckles bone white, his arrogant sneer completely eradicated by raw fear. Darren and Julian have been systematically laundering money through the Sterling Wealth Management firm, I explained, pointing directly at the highlighted columns. They have been actively siphoning funds from Mr. Sterling's charitable foundation. They utilized phantom consulting fees and offshore accounts in the Cayman Islands to bleed the charity dry. Exactly $3 million is missing. The chief administrator gasped out loud, clutching his chest. Nia Sterling's posture went completely rigid. Her dark eyes narrowed into dangerous, unblinking slits as she read the ledgers detailing the exact theft of her father's philanthropic legacy. I swiped to the final, most devastating document in my digital arsenal: the fake LLC registration forms. To protect their fragile, bankrupt legacy, they created a highly complex web of shell companies to hide the stolen charity funds. I continued, my voice steady and unwavering. And as you can clearly see on the screen, they forged my signature to make me the primary director, majority shareholder, and sole liable party for every single fraudulent entity. I looked directly at Julian, who was currently trembling in his chair. Julian proposed to me specifically to bury these illicit ownership transfers deep within the fine print of a prenuptial agreement. They fully intended to frame the clueless nurse for corporate embezzlement and send me to federal prison so they could walk away completely clean. The elite, untouchable facade of the Sterling family completely and violently shattered. The absolute reality of their crimes was now displayed in undeniable high definition for the most powerful woman in the hospital to process. Vivian began hyperventilating. Her chest heaved erratically, her hands clutching frantically at her throat as she desperately gasped for air. The poised society matron was entirely destroyed, replaced by a terrified, suffocating criminal facing the absolute certainty of a federal indictment. Darren shot up from his chair, knocking it over backward with a loud crash. "This is a setup," he yelled, his voice cracking with shrill hysteria. "She fabricated these documents. She hacked my private server. She is insane." Julian scrambled to his feet, his arrogant composure entirely evaporated. He looked at Darren with wild, feral desperation, his survival instincts overriding any remaining family loyalty. "Do not drag me down with you, Darren!" Julian screamed, pointing a violently shaking finger at his older brother. "This was your idea. You said the charity funds were untraceable. You said the nurse was too stupid to figure it out. You said we would be safe. You spineless coward, Darren roared, spit flying from his lips as his own brother threw him to the wolves. You set up the shell companies. You forged her signature on the legal documents. You are just as guilty as I am. The two brothers, entirely stripped of their bespoke suits and elite pedigrees, devolved into absolute animals. Darren lunged across the polished mahogany table, grabbing Julian violently by the lapels of his expensive jacket. Julian swung his fist in a blind panic, catching Darren squarely in the jaw. The sickening crack of bone hitting bone echoed sharply through the glass boardroom. They crashed onto the floor, grappling, punching, and tearing at each other like rabid dogs, in the exact center of the pristine executive suite. Designer fabric tore blood splattered onto the plush carpet, and the grand illusion of the Sterling family legacy burned to ash in seconds. "Get security up here right now!" Dr. Thorne shouted, his voice finally finding its authority as he jumped back from the violent thrashing brawl. The HR director was already frantically dialing the emergency line on the conference phone, screaming into the receiver for the hospital police detachment to respond immediately to the boardroom. Nia Sterling stood perfectly still at the head of the table, watching the two men tear each other apart on the floor. She did not flinch. She did not raise her voice. She simply turned her head, looking at me with an expression of profound, silent respect. I calmly reached out and unplugged my phone from the projector cable. I slipped the device safely back into my pocket, picked up my black leather portfolio, and turned my back on the absolute carnage. The trap had not just snapped shut. It had completely obliterated everything they held dear. I walked out of the heavy glass doors of the boardroom, the sound of police sirens already beginning to wail in the distance, leaving the smoking, ruined remains of the Sterling family entirely behind me. The wail of the police sirens grew deafeningly loud, vibrating through the thick glass walls of the executive suite. Uniformed Atlanta Police Department officers surged into the boardroom, flanked by the hospital's private security team. They immediately descended upon the chaotic brawl, pulling a bloodied, frantic Julian off his older brother. The sharp metallic click of handcuffs echoed sharply as the officers pinned Darren against the mahogany table, reading him his rights. Julian fought against the officer's grip, his eyes wildly searching the room until they locked onto me. The arrogant, untouchable golden boy was entirely gone. In his place was a pathetic, terrified child realizing his life was permanently over. He wrenched himself forward, dropping heavily to his knees on the plush carpet right at my feet. The officers yanked his arms back, but he strained toward me, his face bruised and streaked with tears. "Maya, please," he begged, his voice cracking with pure desperation. "You have to tell them. I had nothing to do with this. It was all Darren. He forced me into it. He said we would lose everything. You know I love you. We were going to get married. Please, Maya, you are a good person. You save people. Save me." I looked down at him. There was no anger left in my heart. There was only absolute freezing indifference. I slowly lifted my left hand. With deliberate, agonizing precision, I grabbed the heavy, flawless diamond engagement ring he had used to secure my trust. I pulled it off my finger. I did not hand it back to him. I did not throw it. I held it out over the half-empty cup of cold black coffee resting on the edge of the boardroom table. I opened my fingers. The diamond dropped with a dull, anticlimactic splash, sinking instantly into the bitter, dark liquid. "You did not love me, Julian," I said, my voice echoing with quiet, absolute finality. "You loved the fool you thought I was. Good luck in federal prison." I turned my back on his frantic, sobbing pleas and walked out of the glass doors. I strode down the polished marble hallway of the hospital I had poured my soul into, feeling a profound, intoxicating weight lift off my shoulders with every single step. The heavy burden of the Sterling family's toxic expectations was completely gone. I was finally free. The fallout from that afternoon in the boardroom was swift, brutal, and absolutely merciless. The FBI took over the investigation within 48 hours, seizing every hard drive ledger and offshore bank account linked to the Sterling wealth management firm. Darren and Julian were formally indicted on multiple federal charges of wire fraud, massive corporate embezzlement, and criminal conspiracy. There were no high-priced lawyers left to save them. Their assets were completely frozen, their accounts seized by the federal government. They were denied bail trading their bespoke tailored suits for standard-issue orange jumpsuits, facing decades in a federal penitentiary. Vivian Sterling experienced a total catastrophic social and financial annihilation. Without the stolen charity funds to prop up her elaborate web of secondary mortgages and leveraged credit lines, her entire fake empire collapsed overnight. The bank formally foreclosed on the sprawling, opulent mansion. She was brutally and publicly evicted, her leased European SUVs repossessed right out of the gravel driveway. The elite country club she had lorded over instantly revoked her membership, having security explicitly escort her off the manicured golf course. Her high society friends, terrified of the toxic federal scandal, completely blacklisted her. The woman who had once mocked my working-class background was suddenly homeless, utterly destitute, and entirely alone, shunned by the very people she had spent her life trying to impress. And Chloe, the sister who had gleefully referred to me as a working-class mule, faced her own brutal reality check. With the family bank accounts frozen and her massive high-interest credit cards severely overdrawn, she was entirely cut off from her luxury lifestyle. She was abruptly forced out of her upscale apartment. To avoid total bankruptcy, the girl who had sneered at my grueling 12-hour hospital shifts was forced to take a minimum wage job. She spent her days in a cheap, scratchy uniform, folding clothes and scanning barcodes at a discount retail store, desperately working double shifts just to pay off the interest on her designer handbags. The cruel irony was an absolute masterpiece. 6 months later, the dust had fully settled. Mr. Sterling, against all medical odds, made a complete and miraculous recovery. His survival was a direct result of my immediate intervention in the trauma bay, a fact that Nia Sterling never forgot. I was summoned to the hospital executive suite once again. This time, I did not walk into a hostile interrogation. I walked into a warm, brightly lit office where Nia Sterling sat waiting for me with a genuine, respectful smile. The cowardly hospital administrators who had tried to fire me were entirely gone, replaced by a new leadership team chosen directly by Nia. Maya, Nia said, gesturing for me to sit in a comfortable chair opposite her desk. "You saved my father's life. You protected his charitable legacy. And you showed more integrity in that boardroom than anyone else in this entire institution. We need leaders like you." She handed me a thick, leather-bound folder. It was not a termination agreement. It was an official promotion. I was formally named the new director of emergency nursing for the entire Atlanta General Hospital system. But Nia was not finished. "My father and I have liquidated the remaining assets of the Sterling Wealth Management firm," Nia continued, her eyes shining with fierce purpose. "We have taken those recovered funds and established a new $5 million scholarship foundation. It is explicitly designed to fully fund the medical education of working-class African American women. We want to tear down the financial barriers that keep brilliant, dedicated women like you out of elite medical spaces. And I want you to sit on the board of directors." I looked at the documents, a profound sense of pride and vindication washing over me. I had walked into this hospital as a dedicated nurse. I had been targeted, belittled, and nearly destroyed. But I had fought back, and I had won. I accepted the promotion and the board seat without a single second of hesitation. I stood on the hospital helipad later that evening. The crisp Atlanta wind whipped around me, pulling at the crisp white fabric of my new lab coat. I looked out over the sprawling, glowing skyline of the city, the vibrant lights stretching out infinitely into the darkening horizon. The sounds of the busy trauma center echoed faintly below me, a steady, rhythmic heartbeat of survival and resilience. They said I was just a nurse. They looked at my skin, my hair, and my bank account, and they said I did not belong in their pristine elite world. They thought I was weak. They thought I was disposable. They were right about one thing. I do not belong in their world of fake wealth, toxic debt, and cruel manipulation. I belong right here in the real world, a world where we roll up our sleeves and fight for survival, a world where we save lives, not destroy them, a world where integrity actually means something. I took a deep breath of the cool evening air, feeling stronger, sharper, and more powerful than I ever had in my entire life. Have you ever been underestimated by people who thought they were better than you? Tell me in the comments below.